A 19-year-old boy slams a mailbox shut on a live grasshopper, and nobody yells cut. A grown man burns down the only house his family ever lived in, and this time the fire is real. A future Oscar winner gets fired from the role that would make him famous, and the man who fired him is Johnny Depp. Somewhere in the middle of all this, a teenage DiCaprio takes a $500 bet to smell a rotten pickled egg, and he wins. This is the quiet little Iowa drama that almost nobody went to see in theaters, and the story behind it is stranger than the movie itself. Stick with me, because the ending of this one, the real ending, involves a letter that DiCaprio wrote by hand in 1993 and then repeated word for word 24 years later. Picture it, rural Texas, standing in for small-town Iowa, late 1992. A 19-year-old DiCaprio is playing with a grasshopper on top of a mailbox for a scene that was supposed to be harmless. He slams the little metal door shut, and the insect loses its head right there on camera. DiCaprio has told this story the same way for years since. Nobody told him he wasn't supposed to actually do it. He was simply instructed to put the grasshopper's head inside and slam the door. So that's exactly what he did. And that was the take the studio kept. There were animal welfare monitors on set specifically to prevent that kind of thing, and they complained afterward. But by then, the footage was already too honest, too unplanned to cut. It's one of the first things longtime fans bring up when they talk about this film, because it captures something true about the entire production. Nothing about it was polished. Almost everything that feels most alive in this movie happened by accident, in the moment, the way real life usually does. DiCaprio built the rest of his performance the same way, piece by piece, almost entirely on his own instincts. The strange little gesture Arnie repeats throughout the film, pressing his fingers against his eyes and dragging them slowly down toward his nose, was never written into the script. Nobody suggested it to him. He invented it himself and later called it a brain wipe, a way of letting Arnie drift off somewhere else so that whatever came next could feel spontaneous instead of rehearsed. What most people don't know is how close he came to never getting the chance to use it at all. According to DiCaprio's own account years later, director Lasse Hallström had genuine doubts about casting him, worried that a magazine-ready teenager was simply too handsome to disappear into a role like this one. So DiCaprio did something most actors his age would never think to do. He spent a full week at a center for children with special needs in that same corner of Texas. And before that, by his own telling, he watched a single tape of a real child with a disability for 3 days straight without stopping, absorbing every small habit and mannerism he could find. He came back to Hallström with what's been described as his own checklist of physical details he wanted to build into the character. A teenager on essentially his third real film, out-preparing actors twice his age, and doing it quietly enough that almost nobody on set realized how hard he was working until they saw the dailies. Here's the twist almost nobody saw coming, and it's the kind of Hollywood what-if that still stings decades later. DiCaprio wasn't the first actor cast in this role. He wasn't even the second. Corey Feldman, already a star from The Goonies and Stand By Me, revealed years afterward on a podcast that he had originally been cast to play Arnie before Johnny Depp ever signed on to play Gilbert. According to Feldman, everything changed the moment Depp joined the production. Feldman claims Depp told the producers in no uncertain terms that he didn't want to work with him, calling him a junkie behind his back. Feldman insists that wasn't true, that he had only recently gotten sober and was, in his own words, trying to help his friend River Phoenix at the time. Whatever actually happened in those rooms, Feldman was out, DiCaprio was in, and Feldman has said he has never once brought himself to sit down and watch the finished film. He still describes himself, in his own words, as a bitter leaf about the whole thing all these years later. It's strange to think that one of the most celebrated breakout performances of the 90s almost went to someone else entirely, and that the film's greatest champion, Depp, may have been the reason it didn't. Because make no mistake, once DiCaprio had the role, Depp did not go easy on him. Years later, accepting a Career Achievement Award at a film festival, Depp stood in front of reporters and admitted it outright, with no attempt to soften it. "I tortured him," he said. "I really did." He explained that DiCaprio was constantly talking about video games between takes, and Depp, who was nearly 30 at the time and working through what he later called a genuinely dark period in his own life, would tease him about it relentlessly, telling him things like he wasn't getting a single drag off his cigarette while he hid from his mother again. Think about what that moment actually looked like from the outside. One of these two men was already a rising star, quietly unraveling behind the scenes. The other was an excited kid who just wanted to talk about Nintendo. And somehow, out of that mismatch, out of a nearly 30-year-old actor being short-tempered with a teenager he found irritating, the two of them produced one of the most tender, believable brother relationships ever put on film. Depp, to his credit, never tried to rewrite that history. In that same interview, he made a point of saying how much he respected DiCaprio's work ethic, how seriously the kid had researched the role, how obvious it was even then that something special was happening in front of the camera. It wasn't all tension, though, and this next part is the kind of detail that makes both of them feel completely human again. Somewhere in the middle of the shoot, Depp got bored between setups and pulled out a long-expired, genuinely rancid, pickled egg. He dared DiCaprio to smell it for $500. DiCaprio, 19 years old and broke by any Hollywood standard, took the bet without hesitating, inhaled the thing, and walked away $500 richer. Picture that for a second. A future 6-time Oscar nominee, a man who would go on to star in Titanic and Inception and The Revenant, hustling cash off of a future Captain Jack Sparrow by sniffing spoiled food in the middle of nowhere, Texas. It's the kind of story that reminds you these were just two kids on a low-budget film set years before either of them had any idea what they were about to become, doing exactly what bored young men do when the cameras stop rolling. What's easy to forget, looking back on all of this now, is how uneven that relationship really was in the moment. Depp was the established name on the call sheet, the reason people bought tickets, already carrying the weight of a career that had started with 21 Jump Street and was quietly heading somewhere darker and stranger with Edward Scissorhands. DiCaprio was still just a kid trying to prove he belonged in the room at all. There's something almost tender about the fact that decades later, once DiCaprio had become one of the most respected actors alive, Depp was the one who felt the need to stand in front of a room of reporters and admit he hadn't been kind enough to him. Most co-stars who tease each other on set let it go, forget it, move on. Depp carried it long enough to bring it up unprompted all these years later, almost like an old debt he wanted to settle out loud. There was a gentler side underneath all that teasing too, one that almost never gets talked about, and it says more about who Depp really was on that set than the torture story does. A large portion of Gilbert's dialogue toward his mother in the film is deliberately, painfully cruel, comparing her to a whale, treating her weight as something shameful in front of the whole town. According to people close to the production, Depp genuinely hated delivering those lines. After nearly every take that required him to say something cutting about her character, he would quietly pull Darlene Cates aside just to tell her how much he hated having to say those things about her. Cates, a first-time actress who had spent years struggling with her own body image and her own isolation, later said those small apologies meant more to her than almost anything scripted into the film. It's easy to remember Depp as the guy who tormented his teenage co-star between takes. It's harder, and maybe more important, to remember that the same man was quietly making sure a vulnerable first-time actress never carried the weight of his character's cruelty home with her. A year after the film wrapped, Depp's own chaos caught up with him in a way that had nothing to do with the movie, and yet somehow it's become permanently tangled up in the film's folklore anyway. In September of 1994, New York police were called to his room at the Mark Hotel and found the place completely destroyed, glass and furniture everywhere, with Depp sitting calmly in the middle of it, smoking a cigarette. His explanation was that an armadillo had gotten loose in the closet and attacked him. Officers searched the room thoroughly. No armadillo was ever found. Depp was ordered to pay nearly $10,000 in damages, and although the charges were eventually dropped, the imaginary armadillo has followed him around in pop culture ever since. A strange, almost funny footnote to the same young man who just months earlier had been quietly apologizing to a co-star between takes for hurting her feelings on camera. It's a reminder of how much turbulence was happening in Depp's life during this entire era, turbulence that somehow never made it onto the screen where all anyone saw was warmth and restraint. That contrast is really the whole story of Depp during this period. On camera, playing Gilbert, he was patient almost to a fault, carrying his family, his mother, his brother, without ever once losing his temper on screen. Off camera, in hotel rooms and late nights, his life was falling apart in ways audiences at the time had no idea about. Watching the film now, knowing what was actually happening to him during and just after filming, adds a strange new weight to every scene where Gilbert quietly swallows his own exhaustion for the sake of people who need him. He was doing exactly that in real life, too, just not in front of anyone who could see it. Through everything, it's Darlene Cates who ties this whole story together, and her arc might be the most emotional thread in the entire production. She hadn't left her own house in years when a screenwriter caught a glimpse of her on a daytime talk show and knew instantly he had found his mama. She had never acted a single day in her life before this film. Think about what that must have felt like, walking onto a professional film set for the very first time at an age when most people have already settled into who they are, surrounded by two young actors who were about to become two of the biggest names in the world, with absolutely no training to fall back on except her own life and her own pain. Before filming ended, the teenage DiCaprio sat down and wrote her a letter by hand, admitting he wasn't the best with words on paper, but telling her she was the most special person he had ever met, and that he would always remember her as the best acting mom he ever had. It's a small gesture, a 19-year-old scribbling something sincere and a little awkward on a piece of paper. But Kate's kept that letter for the rest of her life. She never became a movie star. She took a handful of small television roles on Picket Fences and Touched by an Angel, and then largely stepped away from acting altogether, choosing instead to speak to schools and community groups about body image and self-worth, using the one film she'd ever made as a platform for something more personal than fame. Years later, in 2012, she had lost roughly 240 pounds and was hoping to act again, telling a local newspaper that she could play mothers especially well since she didn't have to dig very far to find one inside herself. She passed away peacefully in her sleep in March of 2017 at the age of 69. When the news broke, DiCaprio, by then an Academy Award winner and one of the most famous men on the planet, posted a public tribute using almost the exact same phrase he had written her by hand more than 2 decades earlier. The best acting mom he ever had. Once in life, once in memory. The same sentence. 24 years apart, sent by a teenager who became a legend to a woman who never expected either the role or the friendship that came with it. It's rare for anything in Hollywood to close a loop that cleanly. A promise made quietly at 19 and kept publicly at 42. But this one did. And then there's the ending nobody expected. The one that took 22 years to actually arrive. This small, quiet Iowa story gave DiCaprio his very first Academy Award nomination, and he lost. The winner that year was Tommy Lee Jones for a much bigger, much louder box office hit called The Fugitive. Most 19-year-olds would call a first nomination a career victory all on its own, and by every account, DiCaprio did too, publicly at least. But it marked the beginning of a pattern that would follow him for more than 2 decades. Nomination after nomination for The Aviator, for Blood Diamond, for The Wolf of Wall Street, each one ending the exact same way, until he finally won 22 years later for The Revenant. All of it traces back to a mailbox, a grasshopper, and a small Texas set where a bored 20-something teased a 19-year-old about his taste in video games. Meanwhile, Depp, the man who tortured him, went on to build Captain Jack Sparrow into one of the most recognizable characters in movie history. The two of them walking completely separate paths from that same starting point. One toward billion-dollar franchises. The other toward the kind of prestige and heartbreak that eventually earned him his statue. Commercially, none of this looked like a success story at the time. Despite glowing reviews and a rare 90% approval score among critics, the film brought in just over $10 million at the domestic box office, barely enough to cover its budget. And it didn't come anywhere near the year's top 100 films. It found its real audience later, slowly, through home video and late-night cable reruns, the kind of gradual word-of-mouth success that turns a box office disappointment into a film people now quietly consider one of the finest of its decade. It's strange to think that a movie remembered today mostly for its performances, its tenderness, and its behind-the-scenes stories about two future legends almost disappeared without anyone noticing at all. What's Eating Gilbert Grape never had the box office numbers or the trophy case its performances deserved, but it gave the world its first real look at Leonardo DiCaprio. It gave Darlene Cates a second act she never expected, and it left behind this small trail of strange human, deeply true stories that somehow feel just as honest as the movie itself. A grasshopper that never should have lost its head, a confession of torture delivered decades later with real regret behind it, a $500 bet over a rotten egg, a letter that echoed across 24 years, two young actors who had no idea, sitting in that small Texas town, that one of them was about to become a franchise icon, and the other was about to spend 2 decades chasing the same golden statue, only to finally hold it in his hands and think back, however briefly, to where it all actually started. Maybe that's why this film has aged the way it has. It wasn't built to be a blockbuster, and it never asked to be remembered. It just quietly kept being true long after the box office receipts were forgotten, long after everyone involved became someone else entirely. Depp went from a struggling young actor with a hotel room full of broken glass to one of the most recognizable faces in movie history. DiCaprio went from a teenager killing a grasshopper by accident to a man who spent 22 years chasing an Oscar he'd already earned the right to hold. And somewhere in between all of that, a woman who hadn't left her house in years found the one role she was always meant to play and never let go of a letter a nervous teenager once wrote her by hand. Do you think DiCaprio should have won that Oscar back in 1994? Or did Tommy Lee Jones earn it fair and square in The Fugitive? Tell me your answer in the comments below. And while you're there, let me know honestly, does this change how you see Johnny Depp and Leonardo DiCaprio's friendship? And if you want the next deep dive into a film hiding just as many secrets as this one, hit subscribe, ring the bell so you don't miss it, and tell me which classic from your generation you want uncovered next.